I would like to call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights to order. I would like to welcome our witnesses as we embark on this study of human trafficking in Canada, a scourge that is a violation of basic human rights, which unfortunately still exists in this country today. And hopefully our committee will be able to come forward with solid recommendations to the Minister of Justice and other ministers in order to better tackle this problem. We're lucky today to be joined by a number of witnesses from different federal agencies who are here to offer us their expertise. We are joined today by the Department of Justice, represented by Mr. Matthew Taylor, Acting Senior Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section, Policy Sector. Welcome, Mr. Taylor. By the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, by Mr. Trevor Bhutsingh, who is the Director General, Law Enforcement and Border Strategies Directorate. Welcome. And Mr. Michael Holmes, who is the Director, Serious and Organized Crime Strategies Division, Law Enforcement and Border Strategies Directorate. Welcome. We're joined by the Canadian Border Services Agency, represented by Ms. Lynn Lawless, Director, Intelligence, Targeting and Criminal Investigations Program Management. Welcome. By the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, represented by Ms. Joanne Crampton, the Assistant Commissioner, Federal Policing Criminal Operations. Welcome. And by the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, represented by Ms. Carol Shepard, the Acting Director, Headquarters Counsel Group. Welcome. So we're going to start with the representations of the Department of Justice. Mr. Taylor, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought it might be helpful for the committee for me to provide information to you on two separate things. First, the legislative history of Canada's criminal laws on human trafficking, and secondly, some background information on the types of programs that Justice Canada has funded to enhance services for victims of human trafficking. Canada's first human trafficking specific offence was enacted in 2002 as part of the enactment of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Section 118 prohibits the trafficking of persons into Canada and targets the means used by traffickers, such as force, fraud, abduction, deception, or coercion, to bring victims into our country. It should be noted that the enactment of this offence coincided with Canada's implementation of the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which Canada ratified in May of 2002. In 2005, Parliament passed Bill C-49, an act to amend the Criminal Code, trafficking in persons, and enacted 3 specific criminal code offences to more comprehensively address human trafficking. Specifically, Section 279.01, which prohibits all forms of human trafficking, domestic or transnational, and for any exploitative purpose. Section 279.02, which prohibits the receipt of a financial or a material benefit, knowing that it was derived from human trafficking. And third, Section 279.03, which prohibits the the holding of identity documents to facilitate human trafficking. Since that time, additional criminal law reforms have been passed by Parliament. In 2010, Private Members Bill C-268, an act to amend the Criminal Code, minimum sentences for offences involving trafficking in persons under the age of 18, was enacted, creating a separate offence of trafficking in children that is punishable by mandatory minimum penalties of imprisonment. In 2012, 2 years later, Private Members Bill C-310 was enacted, enabling Canada to assume extraterritorial jurisdiction to prosecute in Canada Canadian citizens or permanent residents who commit human trafficking abroad. It also enacted a provision, subsection 279.042, that provides guidance to the courts in helping them to determine whether exploitation has been made out, exploitation being an essential element of the trafficking in persons offence. In 2014, former Bill C-36 was passed, enacting the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. This act provided new mandatory minimum penalties for human trafficking involving adult victims and for the financial benefit and documents offences involving child victims. Most recently, the government has introduced Bill C-38, an act to amend the Criminal Code, exploitation and trafficking in persons, to bring in force certain amendments that were passed in Parliament in 2015 through Private Members Bill C-452, also an act to amend the Criminal Code, exploitation, trafficking in persons. These provisions would enact an evidentiary presumption to help prosecutors prove an element of the human trafficking offense. So that's a bit of a summary of the changes that have been enacted by Parliament. And as you can see, these criminal laws in respect of human trafficking have been the subject of ongoing interest and concern by parliamentarians. At the same time, Justice Canada has supported their implementation in various ways, including through the provision of regular training to police prosecutors in conjunction with the RCMP and other police forces, victim services, and other experts. We've developed a handbook for police and prosecutors, fact sheets on key criminal justice issues for police and prosecutors, such as sentencing submissions, bail proceedings, things of that nature in a human trafficking context. Justice officials have participated in similar efforts internationally, working closely with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to develop similar technical assistance tools to support implementation around the world. The department is also supporting improvements to victim services. A copy of initiatives that have been funded since 2012 by the department through the Victims Fund has been provided, I believe, to the clerk of the committee, detailing the specifics of each project. But examples for your information include enhancing victim services delivery in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, supporting the development of a resource handbook for Indigenous women and girls who were victimized through human trafficking, for the purposes of sexual exploitation, and developing a mental health and addictions program for women and girls who were victims of trafficking. I'm going to conclude my remarks there and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. We'll next move to the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee today and its members. Human trafficking is a criminal offense and human rights violation. In Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous women and girls, the LGBTQ2 members and youth, including those in group homes, are particularly vulnerable populations with respect to human trafficking. Public Safety Canada supports the Government of Canada's ongoing efforts to combat human trafficking and to protect its victims, who are among our society's most vulnerable. The department leads federal policy development on human trafficking and chairs a federal, provincial, territorial working group meetings to facilitate cooperation, collaboration, and exchange of information and best practices. Public Safety Canada also manages the Contribution Program to combat serious and organized crime, which provides funding to eligible organizations leading projects related to anti-human trafficking efforts. This contribution program has allowed the department to support, for example, the Northern Outreach Project, which has brought together a circle of grandmothers from Manitoulin Island, Sault Ste. Marie, and the Thessalon to form an action alliance to understand the nature of trafficking in these communities. And funding has also supported Vancouver's Salvation Army's Deborah's Gate in their efforts to expand its Living Hope, Life and Living Skills program to include a barista employment training program, which allows survivors of human trafficking to access trauma-sensitive care and 3 weeks of vocational training. As well, we support a number of research projects to broaden our understanding of labor trafficking and the trafficking of Indigenous women and girls. Part of the work the department leads has included providing information to the public on federal anti-human trafficking efforts through the publication of reports on progress and the development of a quarterly newsletter shared with stakeholders across the country, which highlights events, training, legislative updates, current research reports, and other relevant developments in the anti-human trafficking movement. The newsletter, for example, reports on progress and other resources developed in-house that are publicly available on Public Safety Canada's website. In recognition of the multidimensional nature of human trafficking, the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force brings together officials who cover a wide range of issues, from global affairs to Indigenous issues to law enforcement and procurement, just to mention a few. The Human Trafficking Task Force is led by Public Safety Canada. It's comprised of representatives from key federal departments and agencies. It is the dedicated focal point for all federal anti-human trafficking efforts. Representatives from some of those departments and agencies are here today: Justice Canada, the RCMP, and CBSA, and the PPSC. Public Safety Canada works closely with them, civil society, provincial and territorial stakeholders, and contributes to different working tables across Canada to support information sharing. The department also participates in different international fora as the federal policy lead on human trafficking. Public Safety Canada also works with international partners and agencies such as the UN's Office on Drugs and Crime and the Organization for Safety Cooperation of Europe. The Organization for Security Cooperation of Europe. Last June, as an example, Public Safety Canada led the visit of the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings in a 5-day visit to Canada to discuss the country's progress in implementing the OSCE anti-trafficking commitments. Public Safety Canada has also been represented at the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime Working Group on Trafficking in Persons, and at the high-level meeting of the United Nations General Assembly on the appraisal of the United Nations Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons. Further to this, regular engagement with the United States and Mexico occurs through a trilateral working group on trafficking in persons to encourage the exchange of best practices, regional trend identification, and trilateral collaboration to develop common approaches to addressing this important issue. Through the department's participation in this trilateral working group, we've been able to advance important work, such as the creation of a North American Directory of Service Providers to support victims of human trafficking across North America. Last fall, in October 2017, the evaluation of the 2012-2016 National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking was finalized and has since been made available on Public Safety's website. The evaluation found that there is a continued need to have a national strategy to combat human trafficking, and there are opportunities for the action plan to evolve. The evaluation also emphasized that there is limited reliable data to map the scope of human trafficking in Canada, and that the federal, provincial, territorial collaboration could be strengthened. These recommendations will help inform the Government of Canada's way forward to combat human trafficking. Public Safety Canada and Human Trafficking Task Force members continue to work with our domestic partners, including provincial and territorial governments and non-governmental organizations, to provide dedicated support for the protection to victims, including trauma-informed services designed to address the particular needs of human trafficking victims. Public Safety Canada is taking steps to engage federal, provincial, and territorial stakeholders to enhance collaboration at the national level and to improve Canada's data collection. As part of these efforts, a consultation process is planned for this spring to gather information to help shape federal efforts to combat human trafficking. So to conclude, Chair, I provided a brief overview of the extensive efforts that are taking place within the department to eradicate this heinous crime. Tireless efforts are also being made by dedicated Canadians right across the country. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today on this important issue, and my colleagues and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I believe our next speaker is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bonjour. Monsieur le Président et honorable
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about the roles and efforts of the RCMP to deal with human trafficking.
overarching priority to provide for the safety and security of Canadians, and as such, has a mandate to investigate criminal offences related to human trafficking. To strengthen efforts to combat the trafficking of persons, in 2005, the RCMP established the Human Trafficking National Coordination Centre at National Headquarters in Ottawa. The Coordination Centre is a resource for Canadian law enforcement agencies in their efforts to combat and disrupt individuals and criminal organizations involved in human trafficking activities. As part of its efforts, the Centre develops investigative tools and guidelines, coordinates national awareness campaigns and training, disseminates information and intelligence, develops partnerships domestically and abroad, and coordinates national and international human trafficking law enforcement initiatives. As an extension of the National Centre, there are 3 regional RCMP human trafficking awareness coordinators in the provinces of British Columbia, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. These coordinators raise awareness with regard to human trafficking and build partnerships with law enforcement, government, non-governmental organizations, and the public. These positions are also members of networks that aim to address human trafficking through participation on committees, response teams, and coalitions. Furthermore, in 2013, the RCMP developed a national strategy to combat human trafficking, which outlines current and future efforts in combating this crime. The goal of the strategy is to reduce the prevalence of and the harms caused by human trafficking in Canada and abroad. With respect to the enforcement of legislation, both the Criminal Code of Canada and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act include human trafficking-specific provisions. Numerous additional criminal code offences can apply to human trafficking cases, including but not limited to kidnapping, forcible confinement, uttering threats, sexual assault, criminal organization offences, and prostitution-related offences. Having these provisions enable law enforcement to not only address international but also domestic human trafficking cases. The RCMP leverages Canadian and foreign law enforcement information on human trafficking in order to identify new targets or uncover previously unknown threats. The RCMP is also engaged with groups such as the Santa Marta Group that combines the efforts of NGOs worldwide, clergy from the Catholic Church who collectively work together to eliminate human trafficking. Of note, from 2005 to November of 2017, the RCMP Human Trafficking National Coordination Centre identified 455 cases where human trafficking specific charges were laid. Of the total, 433 were domestic human trafficking cases and 22 were international. Of these cases, 118 have successfully resulted in human trafficking specific or related convictions. These cases involved 321 victims and 180 individuals who were convicted of multiple offenses. Currently, there are approximately 296 human trafficking cases before the courts that involve approximately 506 accused and 420 victims. While these numbers provide insight into the prevalence of this crime in Canada, the clandestine nature of human trafficking and the reluctance of victims and witnesses to come forward to law enforcement, as well as the challenges of identifying victims, make it extremely difficult to assess the true extent of this crime. Furthermore, the statistics identified by the Coordination Centre are derived from human trafficking specific cases across Canada, which the Centre's research has identified and should not be taken as a full representation of the extent or the prevalence of human trafficking. Reporting of these cases to the National Coordination Centre is not a mandatory requirement for law enforcement agencies in Canada. It is worth noting that human trafficking for sexual exploitation continues to constitute the majority of trafficking cases encountered by law enforcement across Canada, which most often is in large urban centres, with most victims being Canadian women. However, more evidence of human trafficking for forced labour has come to light during the past few years, which often involves foreign nationals as victims and perpetrators. As previously noted, the RCMP's law enforcement efforts are coordinated through the Human Trafficking National Coordination Centre. Some examples of our enforcement efforts are: in October of 2017, the RCMP led the 6th edition of Operation Northern Spotlight, which is a coordinated law enforcement outreach operation to proactively engage vulnerable persons in the sex industry and in an effort to identify and assist those who are being exploited or at risk of human trafficking. The Canadian operation involved 57 law enforcement partners across Canada and took place in collaboration with counterparts in the United States and the United Kingdom. As a result of this operation, 14 persons were arrested and a total of 21 charges were laid. In recent years, the National Coordination Centre conducted several mass distributions of the I'm Not for Sale awareness campaign and provided training and awareness sessions to law enforcement officials, prosecutors, government employees, non-governmental organizations, youth, and Indigenous communities. The RCMP has also completed threat assessments on human trafficking. Specifically, Project Safekeeping in 2013 provides insight into the nature and the extent of domestic human trafficking for sexual exploitation in Canada, including characteristics of traffickers and victims. The RCMP continues to monitor and assess the level of human trafficking in Canada. While the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking expired on March 31st, 2016, the RCMP's efforts to combat this crime and associated crime continues, primarily through the National Coordination Centre and in line with the RCMP's national strategy. Going forward, the RCMP will continue to collaborate with its law enforcement partners across the country to investigate this crime and continue to ensure perpetrators are brought to justice. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'd be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much, much appreciated. And now we'll move to the Canada Border Services Agency. Ms. Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to all the members of the committee. I'll only take a few minutes to clarify for the committee the Canada Border Services Agency role and responsibilities in identifying and combating human trafficking. Comme le comité le sait, l'application
As the government knows, the administration and enforcement of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act falls under the responsibility of several government departments and agencies, while Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada has the primary responsibility to develop admissibility policy, which sets the conditions for entering and remaining in Canada. The CBSA shares responsibility with IRCC and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for enforcing the IRPA. In the pursuit of its mandate, the agency shares information and intelligence with other government departments and law enforcement partners as required.
For detecting suspected instances of human trafficking, interdicting suspected human traffickers involved in cross-border movement and exploitation of victims. We contribute to the safety and security of potential victims by ensuring that they are separated from the control of suspected traffickers where they're identified and referring to appropriate government services. And through our efforts of investigation and collection of information, we support the investigation and prosecution of offenders. The CBSA and the RCMP have a complementary approach in relation to the immigration offences. Broadly speaking, the RCMP is responsible for immigration offences related to organised crime, human trafficking and national security. L'ACFC se charge des autres infractions en matière.
The CBSA has responsible for the remaining immigration offences under IRPA, which include offences related to human smuggling, fraudulent documents, misrepresentation, and the general offence section under the Act. The agency will engage the RCMP should it discover indicators of human trafficking while investigating other offences.
Human trafficking cases to the RCMP for investigation and refers potential victims to the IRCC for support. As human trafficking and human smuggling are often confused, I thought I would just take this opportunity to differentiate a little bit between these two offences. On the one hand, human trafficking occurs where one party violates another party's rights by depriving them of their freedom of choice and for the purpose of exploitation. And it can occur both across and within borders and may involve extensive organized crime networks. It involves recruiting, transporting, or harboring individuals through force or through other forms of coercion or deception. Human smuggling, on the other hand, is a form of illegal migration that involves the organized transport of a person across an international border, usually in exchange for a sum of money and sometimes in dangerous conditions. In such cases, when the final destination is reached, the business relationship ends and the smuggler and the individual part company. However, the CBSA is very aware that a person who has agreed to be smuggled into the country may also become a victim of human trafficking at the hands of their presumed smuggler. Upon arrival at the destination, the person may have their movements restricted, they may face coercion, exploitation, contrary to the initial smuggling agreement. Victims may suffer abuse from their traffickers and may face severe consequences if they attempt to escape. Alors là, CFC donne à ses agents une formation.
The CBSA provides training to officers to recognize indicators associated with victims of human trafficking and provides them with support through referrals. Despite best efforts, however, identifying victims of human trafficking at the border can be challenging. Potential victims may be unaware of what is in store for them beyond their entry to the country. Furthermore, if they do know they are being exploited, they may be intimidated and refuse to seek or receive help.
While robbing victims of their freedom, their dignity, and their human potential. The CBSA is an active and engaged partner in combating human trafficking by detecting and disrupting trafficking operations and the transport of victims to Canada. We continue to work with our partners, both domestic and international, with the goal of preventing Canada from being a destination, a source, or a transit country for this criminal behavior. And that concludes my opening statement. Happy to respond to questions later.
Thank you very much. And finally, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, Ms. Shepherd.
Thank you. Pardon me. We were advised that the committee wanted to hear from the PPSC, which is our common name, rather than the ODPP, on the following issues related to human trafficking prosecutions. The first being the challenges to prosecuting human trafficking cases. The second, the agencies with which we work on those cases. Challenges to prosecuting human trafficking in the North, and how the criminal code human trafficking offenses can be improved. First, I should say about the PPSC, and you may have heard that in other contexts from other of my colleagues at PPSC, we are an independent and accountable prosecuting authority, the main objective of which is to prosecute cases under federal jurisdiction in a manner that is free from any improper influence. The PPSC has approximately 1,000 employees, roughly half of whom are lawyers in offices across the country and in the territories. For those parts of Canada that are remote from our regional offices, we retain private sector lawyers to appear as agents in connection with our prosecutions. About 2/3 of our work is occupied with prosecutions under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and the remainder is comprised of tax prosecutions for tax evasion and related offenses, and other offenses created by federal statutes, such as those in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or IRPA, as we often refer to it. In the territories, however, the PPSC has the exclusive prosecuting authority, so we prosecute criminal code offenses in addition to all the federal offenses. Now, Matthew Taylor from Justice already gave you a bit of a roadmap as to the legislative provisions and when they came into force. The offense that appears at Section 118 of the IRPA, the trafficking in persons offense, came into force in IRPA in 2002, and its, I would say, principal distinguishing feature as compared to the offenses in the code is that there's a cross-border element. So somebody is brought into the country by means described in the section, fraud, deception, that kind of thing. The challenges to prosecuting offenses with an international element, I would suggest, are probably quite obvious. There are difficulties sometimes, frequently, in gathering evidence from a foreign country in a format that becomes admissible in a Canadian court. Witnesses who may be required for the case may be reluctant to or unwilling to come to Canada to testify, and we may be stymied in ways of obtaining their evidence otherwise, like by video link. That just may not be possible, or the witness may not cooperate. And my colleagues have already adverted to the fact that human trafficking victims, complainants, may be reluctant to cooperate with the efforts of the authorities to prosecute the people who've trafficked them into the country. Again, the agencies with whom we work in respect of these cases are the Canada Border Services Agency, the RCMP, and other police forces may be involved in investigating and laying IRPA charges. We would have, as I suggested earlier, jurisdiction to prosecute human trafficking offenses in the territories. In the last 10 years, as far as I've been able to determine, in the territories there has not been a charge laid under the IRPA trafficking provision. Finally, with respect to potential amendments to the criminal code provisions, because our jurisdiction is with respect to the IRPA offense, we are not in a position to offer any comments with respect to the criminal code trafficking related offenses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. J'aimerais remercier tous nos invités aujourd'hui.
I would like to thank all the witnesses today for your presentations, very specific. We will now go to questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses today. This is a considerable help to us since we're launching this cross-country investigation. I'll start with you, Commissioner Crampton. You said about the different groups and organizations that you get cooperation of in terms of the prosecution. Is the banking industry one of them?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. There is a project called Project Protect, which involves FINTRAC, and it involves disclosures of transactions of money. And so in terms of banking industry, yes, it would be with FINTRAC, and there's been some very good success in that project in recognizing transactions that could be linked to human trafficking.
That's good to hear. How about other people that aren't directly involved with this crime, but nonetheless are facilitating it, or in some cases helping it? How about the hotel and motel industry? Are they they're cooperative? Do they help out in terms of the identifying these individuals?
So I would say that's more at a local level. Certainly local police of jurisdiction develop those types of relationships. I know from personal experience that would be one of the areas I would develop a relationship, and you know, it's based on relationships though. But yes, I have had good success in that, and I'm sure others have as well.
Thank you very much. I forget who said it. It may be you, Madam Lawless, but there's not a mandatory requirement to report to the center from law enforcement agencies. Maybe that was you, Commissioner?
That was, yes.
Okay, that's something perhaps we could have a look at. I mean, I imagine it would be a great facility to those who are prosecuting these things to be able to get that information.
It would be very helpful. Currently, we look at statistics through Statistics Canada and tracking of files. There's scoring attached to each file, and so that's limited depending on how the file is attributed through the scoring system. But reporting would be very, very helpful.
Fair enough. Mr. Bhup Singh, you talked about statistics and movements of this. Are we becoming more effective in terms of getting these individuals? We heard some statistics here about how many people have been charged over the last 12 years or so. Are we becoming more effective in terms of cracking down on this? on this crime?
Yeah, probably best answered by probably the law enforcement RCMP commissioner, but I would just say I think that we are. I think, you know, the number of charges being laid is up. I think it's a difficult crime to prosecute for a number of different reasons. One is just the general sense of victims not wanting to go to the police. Two, we're finding that technology is playing a greater and greater role, so a lot of these transactions are being taken place with the aid of the internet, and there are limitations around what I would say just using the internet as a tool to provide anonymity. So although I think we're hopeful that we are onto what I would say are the strategies that are used by people that are performing human trafficking actions, it's very, very difficult, number one, to identify them. And then two, I would just say, just with respect to the charges, although they are going up, those prosecutions can be long, timely, and costly.
Okay, fair enough. To perhaps Canada Border Services or anyone might answer this one. I had a meeting in my hometown of Niagara Falls on this subject about a week ago, and one of the people there said that a very young woman didn't want to come forward, even though she's a victim and she's trying to escape. She did not want to come forward, and the reason was she was scared that she would be deported since she was from outside of the country. Do you come across examples like that? That people are worried that if they start talking about what's happened to them, they'll find out that they were smuggled into the country for the purposes of trafficking?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a common concern, and I think the best we can do is try and inform people that, in fact, when they do come forward, they will be referred to IRCC to consider what their immigration options are. And in fact, IRCC, I understand, will be appearing at a later date, but is able to offer temporary residency to those individuals to allow them to remain to participate in the investigation and prosecution.
Is it just temporary residence? And then
there's other options
leave?
available,
There's
but
other
I
options?
would prefer to let my IRCC colleagues
Okay,
respond
I look forward to that
point, yeah.
testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nicholson. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you all very much for being here and helping us as we start our study on human trafficking. I have so many questions for all of you, but I'll try to get through as many as I can. My first question for you, Ms. Lawless. What can you tell me about specific training for frontline officers at CBSA? Do all CBSA officers that are protecting our border have training and the tools necessary to actually spot potential people that are being trafficked? And are there any vulnerabilities right now that you see at CBSA for not being able to address these challenges across the country?
Okay, thanks for that question. Yes, indeed, all frontline officers do receive, as part of their basic training, a course that's called Persons at Risk. So that includes human trafficking, abducted children, youth, people at risk. Okay, so yes, that's part of the basic training. They're taught about the legislation around human trafficking, the human trafficking phenomenon, the differentiation between human trafficking and human smuggling, the indicators of human trafficking. So that's part of theirs, to identify the indicators of how to detect those kind of cases in a port of entry scenario. And they also receive specific training on the procedures to follow, which would include referral to the RCMP, where we would have a suspicion of a human trafficking situation, referral to IRCC to examine the immigration options, and if required, referral to local social services to receive support and counseling as required.
Thank you very much.
That's part of the basic training.
Thanks very much for that. And Ms. Crampton, if I can move to you and get your perspective. Mr. Nicholson asked a question a moment ago on perhaps one barrier for people not wanting to come forward, that being worry about immigration status. You mentioned that there are barriers for people coming forward in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what other barriers there might be for victims wanting or being able to come forward in order to identify their situation to the authorities.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, the immigration piece is significant, but also within the sex trade industry, there's always fear of prosecution for other offenses. There's fear of repercussion. There's intimidation, fear of personal assault. If, say, a sex trade worker could be abused, physically, sexually abused. So there's a lot of other repercussions that they have fear of, and legitimate fear.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, I appreciate your comments, and Ms. Shepherd, you may weigh in on this as well. I'm wondering, with the changes in the criminal code, obviously the intent was to fill in gaps in the law that were not able to be prosecuted for certain offenses, and those have changed over the last 15, 20 years. Have we seen a change in conviction rate of this sort of activity as a result of those measures? And do you see any gaps that still remain for our committee to consider?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think someone alluded to it earlier. In the years following the enactment of the criminal code offenses on human trafficking, there was a certain period of time where implementation was required, so you weren't seeing charges laid for those specific offenses for a number of years. In the early years of the prosecutions, the principal challenge related to proving the element of exploitation, which requires evidence to show that a person in the shoes of the victim would have feared for their safety if they refused to provide labor or services. So there was a lot of uncertainty around that element in the initial days, which led to law reform to help courts and prosecutors understand the kinds of the evidence required to successfully establish exploitation. Would I say there are gaps in the law now? I think it's very difficult for me to answer that. What I could say is, based on the case law, we can see that the courts are now understanding the essential requirements for the offense. They're becoming more comfortable with the kinds of evidence that is required. But by its very nature, human trafficking will always be a difficult offense to investigate because of the power dynamics in between the victim and the trafficker. And so the importance of training and continually reinforcing knowledge amongst the policing and Crown community is really critical from my perspective.
Thank you. And if I may just briefly, what kind of sentencing range are we looking at for most convictions of this type of activity?
I don't have. I can provide the information to the committee. I didn't bring any with me today. I do know that there is a broad range from no imprisonment to significant periods of imprisonment. I wouldn't want to give you a specific number. We know that there are a lot of guilty pleas for human trafficking prosecutions, and that factors into the sentencing. But we also know that the courts are imposing relatively stringent penalties, even in guilty convictions. But I can follow up in writing.
And the mandatory minimums on this type of activity, has there been any charter challenges surrounding that we should be aware of?
There are some that the department is tracking in respect of the mandatory minimum penalty for child trafficking. I don't believe there has been a outcome in any specific case yet involving a constitutional challenge to the mandatory minimums.
Thanks very much. I suspect that's my time.
You have another minute.
Do I? Ms. Shepherd, can I ask you then to comment on Mr. Taylor's remarks with regard to any gaps that may be in the law remaining from your perspective?
I don't have anything to add to what Mr. Taylor said. Certainly with respect to the code, as I indicated, that's not our bailiwick.
Yeah.
We don't prosecute those offenses. And with respect to the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, I don't have any observations to make.
Okay. If I could turn to Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Mr. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name.
Bhup Singh.
Bhup Singh. Thank you, sir. Do you have any comment with regard to collaboration with international partners? How does that look from a Canadian perspective? Are we using Interpol to flag certain cases that come forward that we're aware of? And is there anything we could be doing more on that front to work with our international partners?
Sure, I'll just turn it to my colleague Michael Holmes, and then perhaps Ms. Crampton might have some observations as well, largely because they're tied to some of the international engagement.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I would turn to the RCMP for references to Interpol. In regard to other international engagement, there is a fairly high level of international engagement from the Government of Canada's point of view on human trafficking. We do attend United Nations transnational organized crime meetings on an annual basis. We have, for example, a trilateral working group to combat human trafficking that exists with the United States and with Mexico that has met annually over the last 5 years, coming out of a North American Leaders Summit commitment. And we've attended the United Nations General Assembly in order to portray Canada's position on human trafficking in general. So there's a very wide range. We're engaged on different aspects of human trafficking. For example, on the idea of having a national hotline. There are international examples that we are looking at as a possibility for Canada to pursue. The United States, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Australia either have those kinds of systems or are looking into them as well. So there's a very broad range. It's a very broadly addressed issue internationally, is what I would say.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for getting us started on this fascinating area. I think I want to build on what Mr. Fraser said, asked about Mr. Taylor initially. I'm trying to get my head around the criminal code, and forgive me, but I tried to, first of all, understand where we are with Bill C-38 that you mentioned. Like, I understand that what I have is that the original bill, C-452, was a bill introduced by Maria Morani that amended the code to provide consecutive sentences for offenses related to procurement and trafficking in persons. And it created what you talked about in another context, a presumption regarding the exploitation of one person by another and added circumstances that were deemed to constitute exploitation. And then Bill C-38, which amended that bill, passed with unanimous support, I think almost a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, and it would implement every part of the original bill but the section that implemented the consecutive sentencing part, because the Liberals were still reviewing, and I think they still are reviewing, the issue of mandatory minimum sentences. I guess I just want to know if I've got that right. Is that essentially correct? It's not in force yet, or it is in force?
No, you're correct that the amendments that were passed by C-452 by Parliament are not yet in force. Bill C-38, which was introduced by the government, is in the House of Commons currently. It proposes to amend the coming into force clause of C-452 for the reasons that you've outlined with respect to the mandatory consecutive sentencing. And it's no surprise that it's complicated to follow, because it also relates to another piece of legislation that was passed by Parliament, Bill C-36, which I spoke about, right. And that was the bill that enacted mandatory minimum penalties for trafficking.
It did contemplate a partial proclamation, but nothing is yet in force, like the exploitation, the reverse presumption. Correct. None of that is in force yet.
None of that is in force.
Okay, thanks. What I needed to know. I secondly wanted to, I guess, direct my questions on this to Director Lawless, if I could. I don't know. Today is an important day. We begin our study, and it was also the day that our friends on the Subcommittee of International Human Rights brought in a report that was tabled in Parliament entitled "A Global Fight Supporting Efforts to Address Sex Trafficking in South Asia." So it speaks to the international engagement piece Mr. Holmes referred to, I suppose. One of the things it talked about was, the multi-pronged approach to both national and international combating of human trafficking, prevention, protection, prosecution, and then partnerships globally. On the prevention piece, I guess I'd like to ask what steps have been or could be taken at the federal level to prevent human trafficking for sexual exploitation and forced work. Prevention.
What I can say is, from the CBSA perspective, we do take a broad, multi-pronged approach to addressing human trafficking, and it begins with our network of liaison officers abroad. We have 46 individuals abroad who are abroad specifically to work with foreign partners, immigration, customs, border agencies, police agencies, and as well as with the airline industry, to assist in identifying what we see to be trends, tendencies, and sharing intelligence information, and sharing with those other partners indicators of trafficking in persons, whether it be for sex or for forced labor. So there's a fairly active international engagement with partners to exchange that information, to identify suspected trafficking organizations, and to work with those parties to address that. I've already described our role at the border, but our role extends actually in country as well. In the context of doing other IRPA-related investigations, we do often identify indicators of trafficking associated to things like undocumented labor, etc. So we have a fairly broad approach, and it extends from overseas to in country.
Commissioner Crampton, if I could, you talked about that. I think you gave a statistic of 296 cases that were before the court at the moment. I have old data, so this may no longer speak to a problem, but the data suggests that in 2014, Stats Canada said that charges associated with trafficking in persons are often dropped, and they also said that the majority, I quote, the majority of human trafficking court cases result in findings that are stayed or withdrawn. So over half, if those stats continue to be applicable, of the 296 cases will be stayed or withdrawn if the 2014 data speaks to our current situation. That's a very disturbing number.
It's certainly significant. I do not have those statistics, and I wouldn't be able to speak to necessarily what happens within the court process.
Yes, Ms. Chupper.
There are, I should say, in preparation for my appearance, our case management system produced a report indicating that in the last 12 years, or sorry, the last 10 years, there have been 12 cases where Section 118 trafficking charges were laid. Of those, 2 cases went to trial and resulted in acquittals. But of the 1 case of acquittal, the individual was convicted of a related offense.
Right.
With respect to the remainder, first of all, some of them are still before the court, but I have looked at summaries or information related to several other cases, and although the charges under 118 per se were either withdrawn or stayed, that was as part of a resolution of the case that saw the accused plead to other offenses.
I understand, and I think Mr. Taylor made the point that when you have new sections, you're going to have initial challenges under the charter and the like, and the courts are going to get used to it, and presumably the successful conviction rate will go up. But nevertheless, if notwithstanding what you said, I think it's still a very disturbing number that may or may no longer be true, but I put that out there. Do I have time for one more?
Sure.
This has to do with statistics. The report that I mentioned of the subcommittee that reported today reported that NGOs and state-level actors were working toward eliminating sex trafficking using different definitions and a divergent method of data collection. And then in 2010, Stats Canada's Centre for Crime Statistics also said that very few organizations or government departments systematically collect data on human trafficking. It's 8 years later. Is that still the case? Is there still divergent data collection? Is this a problem or not? I'm asking anyone who might know.
I do think there's still a divergence in the way organizations, countries, institutions define human trafficking, and that starts from the definition of trafficking in persons in the UN protocol. It's a broad definition, and it provides flexibility for different countries to define human trafficking in a way that's consistent with their legal systems. So I think that's one of the overarching ongoing challenges. And then, of course, definitionally at the local level, organizations will collect information relevant to their mandate, relevant to their expertise, and that may differ, for example, than the criminal code definition.
Right, but here in Ottawa, the claim is that different departments collect it different ways and so forth, and so should there be some coordination? Should there be a central repository that where we're talking apples and apples?
There is, certainly through the efforts of the Human Trafficking Task Force, an ongoing effort to try and ensure that we're consistent as a federal government in collecting information on human trafficking. But if you were to think about, for example, our colleagues at Immigration Refugees Canada will collect information with respect to the number of individuals who receive temporary resident permits as potential victims of human trafficking. Department of Justice, police agencies may collect information against the criminal code definition of human trafficking. So there are different data sources being collected for different purposes, but all within the broad understanding of human trafficking as we understand it in the criminal code.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. Mr. McKinnon and Mr. Casey are now going to share the next 6 minutes. So, Mr. McKinnon.
Yes, thanks, Chair. So we've heard a lot of testimony from all of you, actually, on the number of agencies and interdepartmental organizations, task forces, both domestically and internationally. So it's, and on top of that, we have a great number of different laws that can be brought to bear on different aspects of this problem. And I think it was Mr. Bupsing who replied to Mr. Fraser that it does seem to be, we seem to be making progress. I guess my question is, I mean, this is what you have. I guess I'm wondering, what do you need? What do you need to make your efforts more successful and more effective, and to bring this crime even further to its knees?
Sure, I can start. Thank you, Chair. I think one of the first things is, and we've talked a little bit about this, is just really getting ourselves organized around the definition of human trafficking. We've heard just from the discussion, just in terms of the collection of data and information, we want sort of the advice that we're providing as public servants to the government to be evidence-based. And we've struggled a bit in terms of data collection, but that's for a number of reasons. One, for some of the reasons Mr. Taylor mentioned, but also just in terms of human trafficking encompassing not only sexual exploitation, but labor trafficking as well. And so those are clearly two different things. And I would just say, in terms of the disaggregation of that data, it's caused us some problems going forward. Just to answer your question, sir, I would say that one of the things we do need is better coordination and data collection. And I think the other piece for me would be largely around the research into best practices for human trafficking. As Mr. Holmes mentioned, there are some really, really good, what I would say, lessons learned around things like hotlines, et cetera, in different jurisdictions that I think that would be things that we should look at going forward. And I think those provide a basis for us to put forward good advice. I would just say that the evaluation of the last National Action Plan that covered a 4-year period between 2012 and 2016 had a lot of good recommendations in it.
Anyone else like to respond? No. So we heard also about one of the difficulties here is victims don't come forward, and I believe you talked about that with various members already. I guess I'm interested in delving more into that. What can we do to? I mean, there's certain cases like immigration where they're fairly obvious what we can do, but what are the other things we can do to encourage or make it easier for victims to come forward?
Sure. I think again, from a justice perspective, ensuring that the criminal justice system is a place where victims have confidence is critically important, and that's important for human trafficking. It's important for gender-based violence, sexual assault. I mean, it's important across the board. And so the training that is provided to police officers, who are often that first point of contact with victims, is critically important to help them understand the services that they can refer victims to, so that victims will have the confidence to come forward. and report their crimes knowing that they'll be properly investigated. So I think that's an easy thing to say. I think it's a challenge to implement, but certainly focusing on the awareness raising and training, ensuring that victims feel comfortable to come forward would make a big difference.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Just to add a couple of other elements to that, trauma-informed services and providing a link between victims who do come forward and having them able to seek services that can address their particular needs, because the needs of victims of human trafficking are very particular and quite different from many other victims of different crimes. So that's an area that could be, there could be a need there. As part of that, housing needs for victims and for survivors of human trafficking have particular elements to them that make them special, and we are pursuing further research and initiatives along that line to see if those can be developed and distributed and used across Canada. Research and just enhancing our knowledge overall and awareness of the particular vulnerabilities and what leads people into being a trafficked individual is an area where we could gain better knowledge, and even looking at demand areas. So addressing the demands that lead to persons being trafficked, just as a few other elements where I think there's some greater need for knowledge and awareness.
Great, thank you. Those are my questions, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casey. Mr. McKinnon has pretty much taken up his time, but that's okay because now we're going to our short snapper round where anybody can ask questions. So I'd like to recognize you for the first question. Then who else has some questions that they'd like to ask? Mr. Rankin and Mr. Kmich. So Ms. Rudd, Mr. Alder. So no problem. These are shorter questions, shorter answers if possible. But the answers have been excellent, up to date. Start with Mr. Casey.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to get my head around how I can make this into a short question. Yeah. I was on this committee back in 2014 when the certain provisions of the prostitution law were found to be unconstitutional and the government had an obligation to respond to them. We always wonder, after an exhaustive examination like we did, whatever happened. Mr. Taylor, you've referred to it a couple of times, but I think Commissioner Crampton is probably closer to the ground. What impact has Bill C-36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, had on the phenomenon of human trafficking? And so I direct it to you, Commissioner Crampton, and Mr. Taylor, if you have something to add. Thank you.
You can go ahead.
Just to be very, very quick, because I know that's what we've been asked to do. I mean, I think we would always say that more tools in the toolbox are a good thing for police officers. And we knew before the provisions were found unconstitutional and since that police officers would always charge both, or often charge both trafficking charges and prostitution-related offenses. I think that continues to happen today. So it just provides additional tools for police to respond to a particular set of facts. So I think that's a good thing.
It's not that inflexible. You can ask the follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I was actually hoping that one or both of you might be able to, if not necessarily provide an answer in terms of statistics and qualitative, what has been the experience in terms of the impact on human trafficking, the impact on prostitution, the impact on the ability to prosecute. I mean, you've given a general answer, which I would expect from somebody in the policy division of the Department of Justice. I'm sort of hoping if there's someone closer to the ground that can tell us what's actually happening there, if you have that. I mean, if you don't, I expect there will be witnesses come forward later in the study that can. Thanks.
We can certainly give you the statistics. I think the frontline experience is best addressed through the frontline officers.
Thanks very much. Mr. Kmich?
So at the very beginning of the presentation, and I'm not sure now who was it, was Commissioner Crampton or Madam Shepherd, that used a stat 118 convictions, and I wasn't sure what those convictions and which criminal code sections were we referencing, or was it a package of them, out of 433 cases, and as somebody else I think used it, which would be like a 27% conviction rate. But what stat was it? Which criminal code sections were we referring to? Were they cases? Were they specific sections? I'm just trying to grasp what the rate of conviction was, basically.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, which number did you refer to?
Yes, it was 118, I believe is the number used.
Sorry, yes. So it was human traffic specific or related convictions. So it would be any number of criminal code sections that would apply. Okay,
and this is on 433 cases?
That's correct.
So
out of 455.
455, okay. So that's like a 25% conviction rate, 24. So that's really low. What's the main problem with
But not all of those cases have gone through the court system yet. So the rest are still in the court system. And some, if we go through the numbers, you would see some are no longer moving forward, but the rest are in the court system still.
What timeline is the total of these cases from then, from the very moment Section 271 was introduced? Just so I get an idea of the time span that we're talking about.
So this was from 2005 to November 2017. And as I mentioned before, there's a caveat on those statistics in that. Okay, thank you.
Then I was just going to ask on international crimes, and Mr. Bipsing, there was a brief references to it. I know that International Justice Mission does a lot of work overseas in trying to reduce, the prevalence and the kind of impunity a lot of predators and sex criminals have in jurisdictions where it's difficult to prosecute. I guess it's also for Madam Lawless maybe here. International Justice Mission says, on their website, like the Philippines is a country that has a lot of issues with this. According to their website, it goes cyber sex crimes, where the crime is basically like in two different jurisdictions, where these children, as young as 2 years old, could be abused over the internet or over a smartphone, but the person watching the abuse, paying for it as cheap as $20, is paying for it possibly in Canada. So what's being done to help other jurisdictions? And in those cases, are we able to lay charges on Canadians for crime it's like committed like in two different jurisdictions? Like, help me understand this. Can we lay a charge? Is this a criminal act in Canada? Is this something that would be easy to?
I'll start. You had asked about what happens when some conduct occurs in one country and other conduct occurs here in Canada. So I mentioned the extraterritorial application of our human trafficking laws. So it's a slightly different scenario than you've articulated, but if a Canadian citizen or permanent resident commits human trafficking abroad, Canada can assume jurisdiction to prosecute it here in Canada. And we will do that where the home country where the crime has occurred is either unable or unwilling to prosecute within their jurisdiction. In terms of the scenario where the individual is accessing the video in Canada, hypothetically, for instance, they could be charged in Canada with accessing child pornography, possibly, things of that nature. So again, every case is going to depend on the particular facts, but there are some tools available, but I think, as Ms. Shepherd said, there are always challenges around transnational crimes where they happen in more than one jurisdiction.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rudd, then Mr. Rankin. Ms. Rudd?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for joining us today. I am fascinated by and depressed by some of the conversation we're having around here today. So I have a couple of questions fairly quick, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Taylor. I believe it was you who talked about training for prosecutors and for frontline, those on the ground, if you will. Is there training for judges?
The independence of the judiciary being what it is, most training is organized through the National Judicial Institute. The Department of Justice has looked at ways to try and partner with the National Judicial Institute to develop training around human trafficking and continue to explore those opportunities. I'm aware of some training that has been provided to judges, but has there been a comprehensive initiative? I don't believe so.
So you may not be able to answer this question, but do you think it's something that would be of benefit to the system?
I mean, I don't think I can answer that.
I thought you might not,
I don't think I should answer that.
it's-
But what I will say generally is that awareness raising and education for those on the front lines is critically important, especially with a complex area of law.
Thank you. My next question, Mr. Bhupsing, you mentioned something about group homes, and I was curious. I believe it was you, where you said about where there's opportunity for this to occur. And you mentioned group homes, and I'm curious about that because group homes are in all of our communities. They're managed and licensed by provincial governments generally. Can you tell me a little bit about why group homes or sort of what the experience has been?
Well, again, it's just another sort of situation where you may have individuals who are vulnerable, largely because they don't have a support structure around them. They in group homes potentially could be convinced to traffic. In fact, we have heard of some cases where there have been predators in group homes that are actually starting to try to attract individuals in group homes and traffic them. And so I haven't heard a lot. These are just sort of, I guess, new embers that I would suggest. I don't have any sort of specific circumstances that I can speak to, but I know that we're starting to hear cases like that just in different jurisdictions. So that was the purpose of my comment, really just to, number one, identify that we do have vulnerable populations that need a targeted strategy, and the group home situation was just one that, we started to look into.
Okay, thank you. And do I have time for a quick?
One more quick question, sure.
Okay, great. To you again as well. I think actually the question came around how you track this and how you sort of tie the pieces together, and I do know that's always been a challenge. And the Minister of Public Safety in the House this week talked about the Arachnid program and using it in terms of online pornography, et cetera, and like a spider's web can go in and search and provide information. Is that a tool that you see a potential to use in the work that you do?
Potentially. Arachnid is just for the committee, is basically an internet sort of web crawler that goes through and identifies images that have previously to the internet service provider have been identified as sexual exploitation of children, and the web crawler actually goes through and identifies for the internet service provider if those images should be taken down. So it's a new tool that's coming out, and there maybe is a potential, I suppose, for human trafficking images, I suppose. There's a little bit of a difference, obviously, between child sexual exploitation over the internet and human trafficking of people. I don't see why it couldn't be used in a circumstance where human trafficking was taking place and there was child sexual exploitation attached to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rankin.
Try to keep those really short. They are really short. I guess it's for either Mr. Taylor or Ms. Shepherd. Okay, so we're not talking IRPA. We're talking criminal code. We're not talking north. We're talking south. Criminal law, it's attorneys general. It's your crown counsel in different provinces that are going to be doing this. Am I right? So the charging standard is also going to be different. Like in my province of British Columbia, you have to show a substantial likelihood of conviction. Others don't have anything like that. So I'm going to guess that it varies quite dramatically between the provinces, the conviction rate and the willingness to lay charges. Have I got that right?
Ms. Shepherd might be able to correct me. I think that while the standards might be worded slightly different in terms of charges, I think they amount more or less to the same thing: reasonable prospect of conviction and being in the public interest to proceed. I think it's going to depend on local knowledge and practice. You have some Crown Counsel that are becoming specialized human trafficking prosecutors, and with that, their experience and familiarity with the provisions. Others may approve or go forward with charges that they're more comfortable with. A prostitution-related charge, for example.
Certainly heard RCMP officers complain about British Columbia pretty bitterly about the standard being very different, but that's a longer conversation. Mr. Boopsing, I wanted to go back to a comment you made about the internet and how hard it is getting increasingly difficult. So organized crime is involved in a lot of this, obviously, and the increasing use of the dark web and all of the extraordinary encryption technology is going to make it, I would have thought, very, very difficult to get at some of these crimes. The more that goes on the web and the more that encryption technology is used. Is that accurate?
Well, certainly I can just offer general comments. Yes, I think that new technologies and encryption provide difficulties in terms of hiding a lot of this information that law enforcement or others might use in terms of pursuing some of these investigations. So in general, yeah, I think it's difficult. But I mean, we're developing all sorts of I think strategies and tools to try and get at that. But that doesn't just apply to human trafficking. There are a whole range of things that take place. Just to comment a little bit on the first point that you made about organized crime, there does typically tend to be organized crime involvement in human trafficking, and I would just say that it's one of many things that organized crime is involved in. I know there are some recent statistics on organized crime involvement in human trafficking. Unfortunately, I don't have them here with me this afternoon, but perhaps we could provide those for you.
Thank you. That'd be helpful, I think, if we could get that information.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Mr. Aldig?
Great, thank you. So I'm just visiting this committee for today. This isn't my area. I normally sit on the Environment Committee, so the topic of human trafficking is brand new to me. It's fascinating. I commend those of you who are in the field for working on this important issue and for this committee for digging into it. I have kind of a series of questions, and I'll never be invited back if I go over my time, so I'll just kind of throw them out there, and if anybody wants to make comments, please do. But when I think, Mr. Taylor, you had started with the legislative framework, and as I was wrapping my head around this, it seemed like there was, to get us to where we're at today, there's some government legislation that's been there, and then there's been some private members' bills, and it seems when you have private members' bills coming in on government legislation that you may not have a cohesive piece of legislation. And so the first question I have, it relates to the whole legislative framework on this important topic, and do we actually have the right set of tools, or is it a bit of a hodgepodge of legislation that, or do all of these pieces actually fit together to give those in the field who are doing enforcement and prosecution the right tools to go after this? That's kind of the first. If there's a quick response to that, it's just, do we have the right legislative tools?
I mean, they're all in the criminal code. They all complement one another. As to whether we have the right mix, I think time will tell. As I said earlier in my remarks, the jurisprudence seems to suggest that the provisions are working as they were intended when debated and discussed by Parliament. But in our role as advising the government, the minister, we're always looking at whether the law is working as it was intended, and then advising on what improvements can be made if those are desired.
Okay, and then the second piece of it, it's sort of a flowing train of thought here, but questions that come to mind, it's do we actually know who the victims are? And then from that, do we know who the perpetrators are? I think that it was mentioned organized crime is involved in this, but is it primarily organized crime driven? Are there kind of one-offs, domestic individuals, or what's the mix here? Do we actually have the data to know who's the victim, who's doing it? The numbers that presented, I actually thought that, well, actually, I don't know what I thought. I thought, well, these seem like low numbers, and yet they're high numbers for what I would expect in Canada. For what's been identified, but then the convictions seem low, and it's been said that it's kind of working its way through the system. But it's just like, what's the magnitude here, and do we actually have a handle on that? Do we need to do more? Is there a way of capturing what's involved with this? And then flowing from that, it's like, what's behind it? That somebody mentioned the power dynamics, but ultimately, is it about money? and which then brings me to the organized crime. And then flowing from that, I tend to think as a legislator, we're working on legalizing cannabis as an example, and part of the motivation for that is to take billions of dollars out of organized crime's hands. And if we're doing that, is that actually going to create a motivation for them to go after other sources such as this? And do we have the right tools? Are we prepared for that? Should organized crime move in that direction? So just sort of a train of thought of questions, and there's probably no simple solution, but if anybody has any comments on that, it may help the committee as they move forward on their reports and investigations.
Sure. Chair, why don't I start, and then I'll turn it to my colleagues. You mentioned the stats, so just to give you a sense of, we talked about the body of human trafficking cases. 95% of those are domestic cases, roughly about 5% of them are international. The majority of the domestic cases involved are young female Canadians trafficked for sexual exploitation. The latest Eurostat on trafficking in persons, I think, is July 2016, indicates that between, I think, a 5-year period, 2009 and 2014, 93% of human trafficking victims in Canada were female. And almost half of them were between the ages of 18 and 24. And 1/4 of those individuals were under 18. So that gives you a little sense in terms of who's being victimized. The other thing I would say about that is just most of the risk, I think, in terms of being victimized through human trafficking in Canada tend to be those groups that are either socially or economically disadvantaged. And that's not only a domestic sort of observation, that's an international observation as well. And so maybe I could just start with some of the organized crime pieces. This crime is highly lucrative. We're hearing that somebody who's human trafficked can provide profits of up to $1,000 a day. And so that is highly lucrative, and as we know, organized crime usually tends to move to those areas that are highly profitable. So.
Thank you. Mr. McKenzie?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee. Commissioner Crampton, I think one of the things that we somewhat miss sometimes is we look up here and we need to look down here to see what's going on. And perhaps you can enlighten us. It would seem that most of the routes for human trafficking also take the same route as contraband, tobacco, guns, drugs, and other things. And many of them are, when we talk about organized crime, we all have a different view of organized crime. But at this level, outlaw biker gangs tend to be at the ground level, moving people and moving commodities. And as a result, when we talk about charges, frequently the police and the Crowns will lay charges where they believe they'll get convictions to disrupt it, and it may not be in the human trafficking. Would I be half right on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes and no, I guess. In terms of organized crime, there's certainly a significant involvement in human trafficking. Within Canada, most of our international persons trafficked is with regard to forced labor. The rest is sexual trade across Canada. With regard to organized crime, of the known crime groups in Canada, approximately 9% are involved in human trafficking or the sex trade. But that's not to say that in terms of overall trafficking, I would say yes, organized crime is significantly involved. And that would include biker gangs and areas like that.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Fraser, you had a short question?
I did. Just a clarification question following up on Mr. Kmitsch's point for you, Ms. Crampton. Just talking about the conviction rate, I think the number 455 cases referring to human trafficking was mentioned, and the convictions were at 118, and I understand that there are still some going through the criminal proceedings, so those wouldn't be reflected. But just to be clear on this so we understand, the 455, does that include cases where the accused may have been pleading out on something else or actually been convicted of something else? and maybe there were challenges in actually getting a conviction on that, or are those cases that actually went to trial and there was a guilty or not guilty finding?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So of the 455 cases, those cases are human trafficking specific charges were laid. And of that, 433 were domestic, 22 were international, and 118 have successfully resulted in human trafficking specific or related convictions. And again, of that, 296 are still before the courts.
96. Okay, thanks.
Short question.
I did. And again, like my colleague, Mr. Aldag, I'm not a member of this committee. I'm a member of Natural Resources. I guess you talked about the number of cases and the number that are still yet to go through that have resulted from a fairly significant time frame. Mm-hmm. Someone mentioned the victims and support for the victims. As some of these cases are taking, from what it seems like, a very significant amount of time to get through the system, what supports are there for these victims that are having to manage their lives while they're waiting for this process to unfold? And what are we doing to help them not reintegrate back into that situation?
If I may, Mr. Chair, in terms of policing, we partner with victim services, various social services, housing, various departments, even through Northern, or through the identification of sex trade workers that are at risk as well, that project I referred to. We work with partners during that project to make sure the supports are there for anyone who does self-identify as being a victim or being trafficked. So we very much work with partners in that.
Thank you very much. So I think that that puts an end to the questions today. I want to thank this very illustrious panel for having come before us today. Your comments were very, very helpful to get us started on the study. And I want to thank you all very, very much. And have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Meeting adjourned.